You're watching Q News and this is the Economic Bulletin. I'm Henny Saif and we'll bring you the latest developments shaping the global economy. From key market trends and financial updates to regional economic highlights and forecasts, we provide essential news and analysis to keep you informed. Welcome back. We'll start off with the Indian Trade Minister, Piyush Goyal, who has announced that his country and Britain have officially decided to resume discussions on a proposed trade agreement. Speaking at a joint press conference with the British Business and Trade Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, Goyal emphasized that both nations are committed to speeding up negotiations. The talks are seen as crucial amid rising global uncertainties, including the potential for reciprocal import tariffs from the United States. The negotiations will focus on finalizing a bilateral free trade agreement and an investment treaty, with both sides aiming to strengthen economic ties. German business leaders have urged the swift formation of a new government following Sunday's election, emphasizing that Europe's largest economy cannot afford delays in addressing critical challenges. Speaking the morning after the national elections, Peter Libinger, president of the Federation of German Industries, expressed concern that a lack of direction was his greatest fear. He emphasized the urgent need for swift, clear and transparent measures to promote greater investment, foster innovation and reduce bureaucracy. Libinger further stressed that economic competence must be a top priority for any new coalition government. Moreover, the latest IFO Institute survey has reported that Germany's business morale unexpectedly stagnated in February. This dealt a blow to hopes of an economic recovery as the country entered coalition talks following Sunday's election. The IFO Business Climate Index held steady at 85.2, missing analysts' forecasts of a rise to 85.8. Thailand's Finance Minister Pichai Chunahavara has urged the Bank of Thailand to consider cutting interest rates to stimulate economic growth and weaken the baht, which would support the country's export sector. Pichai argued that low inflation, which averaged 0.4% in 2023 and stood at 1.32% in January, provides room for a rate cut to boost economic momentum. Pichai also pledged further steps to address Thailand's high household debt, urging banks to increase lending and the central bank to relax loan-to-value rules to support the struggling property sector. The finance minister emphasized that low inflation over an extended period could hurt producers by reducing goods prices. Peru's economy minister, José Salardi, has expected that Peru's gross domestic product to expand by 4% in 2025, making it the second fastest growing economy in Latin America. He added that inflation is expected to remain stable at approximately 2%, continuing the trend after closing 2024 at 1.97%. The Andean economy is rebounding from a recession, with positive projections driven by high copper and gold prices, key exports for the country, and reduced regulatory barriers to boost investment. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that Ukraine and the United States are working productively on an economic deal aimed at supporting Ukraine's recovery and contributing to efforts to end Russia's conflict. Speaking via video linked to G7 leaders, including US President Donald Trump, Zelensky emphasized the importance of involving both Europe and Ukraine in any peace process.
And we need to meet as soon as possible to define the terms of peace and security guarantees. Our teams are already working productively with the US on economic agreement, which we hope to sign in Washington. And President Trump, we would really like to hear from you, because all our people, our families are very worried. Will there be support from America? Will America be the leader of the free world? And I want to be very honest with you. For our people, for life in general, it's so important that American support, American assistance remains. And really, I believe we can be just as effective in securing real guarantees for peace.
The European Union has officially approved its 16th sanctions against Moscow. The new measures target Russia's so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers, banks, aluminum imports, and other critical sectors. This latest package includes restrictions on 73 additional vessels used to evade sanctions, bringing the total to 153. For the first time, the EU has also imposed a transaction ban on financial institutions using Russia's SPFS payment system, a domestic alternative to SWIFT. Additionally, sanctions have been expanded to include 53 entities supporting Russia's military, 8 propaganda outlets, and new trade bans on chemical precursors and other materials. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has urged G7 nations to take greater risks in imposing sanctions on Russia. Starmer stressed the need for stronger action against Moscow. He announced that Britain would soon roll out its largest sanctions package since the early days of the conflict. The new measures will target vessels helping Russia evade sanctions and companies, including those in China, supplying military components to Moscow. Additionally, the UK plans to ban entry for individuals who support the Russian state or owe their wealth to it. In a recent briefing, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov has commented on the European Union's 16th package of sanctions against Russia, stating that it was quite predictable. He remarked that the new sanctions package was predictable and suggested that the Europeans were continuing to follow a path of escalating sanctions. Data from the Centre for Research on Energy and Clean Air revealed that European Union countries spent nearly 22 billion euros on Russian oil and gas in 2024, surpassing the 19 billion euro allocated to support Ukraine during the same period. The EU's 21.9 billion euros expenditure on Russian oil and gas in 2024 was 1/6 higher than the 18.7 billion in financial aid provided to Ukraine. Russia's energy export revenues reached 242 billion euros in 2024, bringing its total earnings from energy exports during the 3-year war close to 1 trillion euros, despite Western sanctions. Oil and gas revenues accounted for half of Russia's tax income, with Moscow bypassing sanctions using a shadow fleet of hundreds of older, inadequately insured tankers. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has announced a 3.5 billion euro financial aid package for Ukraine during her visit to Kiev on the anniversary of the 3rd year of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. The funds aim to provide additional liquidity to Ukraine's strained budget and support the purchase of military equipment from its domestic industry. This package is part of the larger 50 billion euro Ukraine facility established by the European Union in early 2024. She also announced plans to integrate Ukraine and Moldova into the EU's electricity market by the end of the year. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has announced that his country will provide Ukraine with a new military aid package worth €1 billion this year. The aid is part of a 10-year bilateral security and defense agreement signed in May 2024. Last year, Spain also contributed over €1 billion to Ukraine's defense efforts. Sanchez said at the summit that they will continue supporting Ukraine as long as necessary.
Three years into the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Western nations are ramping up economic pressure on Moscow with new sanctions, while shifting global dynamics raise fresh uncertainties. The UK has announced its largest sanctions package, targeting Russian aluminum imports and blacklisting 53 companies accused of supplying military components to Moscow. Meanwhile, a €3.5 billion aid package for Ukraine is set for release in March as European leaders push for stronger military and economic support. But with shifting US foreign policy under the Trump administration, concerns are growing over Washington's commitment to Ukraine, prompting Europe to reassess its defense and economic strategies. As the conflict continues, the global economic landscape remains in flux, with sanctions, trade restrictions, and political shifts shaping the next phase of the crisis.
And we're joined from Washington, by the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center of Washington, Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, to discuss the latest developments related to the economic aspect of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict as it enters its third year. Welcome to Q News, Mr. Russell. First off, 3 years into the conflict, Western nations continue imposing sanctions on Russia, but how effective really have these measures been in weakening Moscow's economic resilience?
Well, thank you for having me, as always. The sanctions are debatable right now. When the U.S. and our NATO partners and the rest of the global community put what we thought were going to be heavy economic strangling sanctions into place against Russians and, more in particular, their key business figures, they thought that would be enough of a stick to get Moscow to kind of back off of a full-on military onslaught into Ukraine. That apparently has not worked. We're 3 years into the conflict. So as far as sanctions go, there's debate on whether or not the sanctions have truly worked. Again, we're going into a very closed media type situation with Moscow. Moscow's not going to show any sort of weakness, either by military or by economic angles. So it's hard to understand. My personal belief is that there is some economic stress going on inside Russia. There's some economic stress being put on internally in Moscow onto Putin. But again, Putin has a very strong arm in Moscow, so we'll have to see how that plays out going into our third year.
Mm-hmm. Well, the UK has announced its largest sanctions package since the early days of the conflict, and the EU has also implemented its 16th round of sanctions. Are these new measures enough to significantly impacting Russia's economy?
Again, nobody knows truly. The sanctions, every time that there is sanctions put into place, there are always slight little loopholes involved. So there's always a nuance. That's something that some of the greatest sanctions lawyers in the world have noticed that's been going on with the economic pressures on Moscow. So if the EU and the UK and our European partners are putting more sanctions on, it depends on what loopholes that they can find in this that will not completely cut off Russia. And, are they going to be strong enough and have enough of an impact on the Russian people to get them to push back against Vladimir Putin?
Mm-hmm. Well, these sanctions earned despite these sanctions, Russia has earned 242 billion. And you keep mentioning that Russia is feeling some sort of economic stress. Where's that stress coming from?
I think regarding your first question is the fact that Russia has made money on the energy sector. Yes. I mean, again, this goes back to the idea that there are loopholes. Are they using middlemen? Are they, in fact, capitalizing on a black market that is very energy dependent right now? Globally, there's a lot of regions in the world that need energy more than they need friends in the West. So that's one aspect of it. Regarding the question of where where Moscow is feeling the economic pressures, I think it comes down to the Russian the Russian consumer. Are the Russians paying more for their common staples than they were before? Are they having less selection than what they had before because of these sanctions? Russians have truly believed that they love the Western market products, but they are also very supportive of the strong-handed Vladimir Putin-esque type of regime that is in place right now. So that being the case, I think what's going to happen is as the economic pressures grow on the Russian consumer, which we're starting to see right now, in my opinion. That, along with the fact that we're also starting to see a little bit of a wrinkle in public support for the Russian war. The Russian population is becoming a little bit punch drunk and a little bit weary of how effective this war has been, contrary to Vladimir Putin's large-scale nationwide marketing effort to show that this special military operation has been a huge success for Russia. I think there's a lot of pressure building on the economic side, and I still think there's probably some pressure building on just the general public support for the war.
Mr. Russell, the European Union still spent nearly 22 billion euros on Russian oil and gas in 2024, more than it actually allocated to aid Ukraine. So how does this contradiction affect the credibility of the West's economic pressure on Russia?
That is an incredibly great question, and I don't think that there's a real answer to that. Here's the catch-22. When you are Russia and you have one of the largest energy supplies into Europe, there's a certain need that the European nations have to have. Where are they going to see that energy come from if it doesn't come from the infrastructure that's been built out over the past several decades from Russia into Europe? You're talking about your gas, your hard oil, the heating requirements, the energy, the production of electricity, all of that. That heavy demand on Russian energy is not going unnoticed, and they're going to have to pay for it. That being the case, there have been several other opportunities that have popped up that, perhaps, natural gas supplies from Qatar, and Qatar being a pipeline for that. The other Gulf states, such as the Emirates, the Saudis, being able to try and offset that requirement and that need for Russian or that dependence on Russian energy. So the hypocrisy to that angle of your question, the hypocrisy is very real right now. We're seeing that it's been a unified voice up until now between the United States and our European partners, and in particular our NATO partners, saying that we will defend Ukraine at all costs. We will support Ukrainian sovereignty at all costs. With the recent changes in government here in the United States, the Trump administration has taken a lot more of a 180 approach to Ukraine, whereas the Biden support was universal and it was consolidated with our Western and even our Eastern European partners. Donald Trump has caused a big rift in the relationship between Washington and Europe and NATO. That being the case, I think that the hypocrisy there is we still need the energy. We're not going to clamp down on imposing the full set of sanctions, but we're not going to do it at the risk of our own infrastructure, of our own people. That's where the hypocrisy lies. Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of Trump now, with his administration's approach to foreign policy shifting towards the EU, towards Ukraine. How could changes in the US support affect Ukraine's economic future?
How does it affect Ukraine's economic
Yes.
future? Everything depends on the future of the sovereignty of Ukraine. It depends on Ukraine maintaining its sovereignty, maintaining its independence, and maintaining a strong alliance with the Eastern European partners that have been directly involved in supporting them. You're talking about the Baltic states. You're talking, more importantly, Poland, which has been a key ally of Kyiv in President Zelensky in this. So the reality is the future of Ukraine's economy is based on how long it can maintain its sovereignty. Without a sovereign Ukraine, there is no Ukrainian economy. It gets blended in, or it gets forcefully taken over and merged into a Russian economy. I don't think that helps the Ukrainians. We've seen situations like this where Russia has come in, taken over the economy, and is almost used it as a weapon against those that have gone against the Russian ideal or the Russian mantra. So there's a lot of factors. It's still a very fluid situation, but the bottom
Yes.
line is, where goes the war, goes the Ukrainian economy.
Mr. Justin Thomas Russell, the Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center from Washington, thank you very much for joining us, sir. And now we move on to the latest developments from the MENA region. Remittances from Egyptians working abroad has jumped 51.3% in 2024, reaching $29.6 billion. According to the Central Bank of Egypt, remittances reached $3.2 billion in December, their highest level since the exchange rate liberalization. In November, they surged 65.4% year-on-year to $2.6 billion, following $2.9 billion in October. For the first 5 months of the fiscal year, remittances totaled $13.8 billion, a 77% increase from the $7.8 billion recorded in the same period last year. Moreover, during the first 11 months of 2024, total remittances reached $26.3 billion compared to $17.9 billion in 2023, highlighting a strong upward trend. The European Union announced the suspension of several sanctions against Syria, including those targeting the energy, banking, transport and reconstruction sectors. The EU foreign ministers meeting in Brussels agreed to lift restrictions on the energy sector, including oil, gas and electricity, as well as sanctions on the transport sector. Additionally, asset freezes on 5 banks were removed, restrictions on the Syrian Central Bank were eased, and an exemption for humanitarian aid delivery was extended indefinitely. However, the EU maintained other sanctions related to the Assad regime, such as those on arms trading, dual-use goods, surveillance software, and the international trade of Syrian cultural heritage. And moving to the stock markets, the global shares displayed mixed performance during Monday's session. Futures for the S&P 500 edged down 0.02%, while those of the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 0.32%. In Europe, France's CAC 40 was down 0.87%. Britain's FTSE 100 inched down 0.14%, and Germany's DAX went up 0.4%. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index declined 0.58%, the Shanghai Composite dipped 0.18%, and the Nikkei 225 increased 0.14%. Gold prices surged to a record high on Monday, driven by safe haven demand amid concerns over U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff plans, with additional support coming from inflows into the world's top gold-backed exchange trade fund. Spot gold rose 0.2% to $2,941.6 an ounce. It hit $2,956.15 earlier in the session, its 11th record high in 2025. U.S. gold futures added 0.2% to $2,957.50. These were all the economic news we have for now, and here's a reminder of the main stories we've been covering. Germany's business morale stagnates in February. The European Union officially approves its 16th sanctions against Moscow. And remittances from Egyptians working abroad has jumped 51.3% in 2024. This concludes our economic bulletin for today, but please don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram and TikTok at Q News EGY to stay informed. I'm Henny Saif, thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates here on Q News.